Good morning. Good morning, colleagues. Can I ask you please to take your seats? Can I ask you please to take your seats so that we can make a start shortly? Thank you.
Bore da. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our conference on the right to decide. The first thing to say is that there is interpretation in English, Spanish, French, Dutch, and also passive interpretation in Catalan and Galician, which means that you can speak Catalan and Galician, but you won't be able to listen to those languages. Unfortunately, today we don't have Welsh, but I'd still like to say bore da, pawb, a chroeso I gynhadledd Cyngor Rydd Europe. Good morning and welcome to the conference organised by the European Free Alliance. My name is Jill Evans. I'm the President of the European Free Alliance group in the European Parliament, but we are also supported today, of course, by the European Free Alliance political party, which comprises many, many more parties across Europe who are working on the same agenda. I'm not surprised to see so many people here this morning because the conferences that we have organised have all been well attended. And just a few years ago, our policies for greater autonomy for all peoples and for independence as an aim were dismissed as irrelevant and unachievable, particularly within the European context. We were always being told that it was only member states that counted, only member states that could shape the future of Europe and chart the way ahead for all of us. But events today, of course, in Scotland, in Catalonia and in many other nations and regions within the European Union and beyond will change the course of history. This is a very exciting time for all of us, and I think especially for the European Free Alliance, because our existence is based on the promotion of this different kind of politics. We want a real Europe of the peoples, where there is equality. Equality of languages, equality of cultures, equality of nations. We believe in a Europe which really does value its diversity in every sense. And we want to reclaim Europe for the people of Europe. We are all rebuilding our economies, and we want to restore people's faith in this unique project by making Europe work for its people. Now, I know why people are Eurosceptic. I can sympathise with that. We are not uncritical of the European Union. We want major reform of the EU. And that's what the European Free Alliance is all about. The biggest and most important reform of all, which is making Europe democratic, giving people the power to shape their own future. And I'm very proud to lead a group in Parliament that sees the value of our European partnership and peaceful cooperation, that has a vision for the future. We believe in independence, not dependence. I represent Wales, which is not a poor nation, but it's an impoverished nation because of successive London government policies. When it comes to the vote here in the Council of Ministers on whether cuts in European Union funding to Wales will be carried out, for instance, it's the UK Minister, not the Welsh Minister, that has the vote. That means that the Welsh national interest is not promoted or defended. On the contrary, it's undermined. We have the right to determine the kind of society we want. In Wales, we are moving slowly but surely towards achieving that. And what's interesting about IFA is that we are a network of parties moving in the same direction. We are travelling along the same road, but we are each making our own unique journey. A few months ago, we saw the Catalan Way, thousands of people linking hands across Catalonia for independence. It was a reflection of the Baltic Way that took place in the 1980s, calling for the independence of the Baltic countries, which did happen, of course, and which transformed Europe. But Catalonia will find its own way forward, as will Scotland, Wales, Flanders, the Basque Country, all of us. We can support one another and we share experiences, we help one another along the way, but we have to make the journey ourselves. And a few months ago, when I was with Daniel Turp in Moran in a discussion, then he said, all people have the right to self-determination. That is the bottom line. That's the basis of everything that we do, and that's why we're here today, to have this very important discussion. I'm delighted to have such a prestigious panel of speakers and a very exciting programme for today. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ian Hudgton from the Scottish National Party, who will chair the first session. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Jill, and many thanks to all of you for coming along, and welcome to those who are choosing to take part in these proceedings by web streaming, which is happening live, I'm told. So, without further delay, because I do want to try to keep up to time and, in particular, to allow some time for discussion, I propose to take our first panel of speakers in the order in which they've been billed in the pre-circulated programme, which means that going first and to give us a presentation on the right to decide from his point of view, Jaume Lopez. Jaume is a Catalan academic and he is an associate professor of the Pompeu Fabra University of Barcelona, as well as the Open University of Catalonia. And during his career, he has worked on political theory. He's written publications on party systems across Europe, direct democracy, and key to today's subject, self-determination, as a way to improve democracy in Europe. Jaume, take it away. Thank you. Yes, there's passive, should have repeated that, passive interpretation, which allows Catalan and Galician to be spoken but not listened to.
Okay. So, gràcies per la invitació a parlar sobre el dret a decidir.
Thank you for the invitation. I will speak in Catalan today. And the first minutes, what I'll do is can you hear me? Can you hear me in English?
Dividir la meva presentació.
I will have two parts in my introduction. I will try and give a definition and talk about the basis, and the second part of my intervention will talk about Catalonia to explain how this idea of the right to decide has been a central element in the recent events that we lived in Catalonia and that were talked about just a minute ago. We have talked about the right to decide, and we'd have to specify what it's about. When we say the right to decide, what is it? And we could do it basing ourselves on 10 points that will help us to understand this political principle. And I could say that it's a political principle of the 21st century and for the 21st century. First of all, it's a political principle actually, it is not a positive right. It's not a recognized right, not a right that's been recognized in any legal document, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a legal basis, as we'll see further on. All these rights have been debated on and have been incorporated in legal text. That's what happened with self-determination around 1945. We have to make a difference between a political principle and a right, and that difference sometimes is not all that clear. For instance, when we talk about some rights in constitutions, although they have a legal basis, they don't have a practical translation. In the Spanish constitution recognizes the right to housing. So what difference is there between the political principle and the right? There's hardly any difference at all. But the right to decide is considered to be a political principle and something that's been created in the 21st century. And it'll have it's applied mainly in Western democracies. A lot of its defenders initially they thought the right to decide was the same as the right to self-determination. That was their initial reflection. There are links between both ideas, obviously, but we also have to say that the right to self-determination from 1945 onwards, and as time went by, has been interpreted in a more restrictive way and a more precise way, thinking about the decolonization processes particularly. And the United Nations Decolonizations Committee, well, has different situations to deal with still. There's the Western Sahara, Gibraltar, and sometimes reference is made to this situation as a similar problem that could be interpreted as an internal colonialism, but that would be stretching the concepts rather a lot, and that's not what the right to decide is about. So the basic problems are the same, but we have to make a distinction between the political principle and the right to the classical right to self-determination. They're two different things. And the third principle, or the third characteristic to of the right to self-determination, is that there's no restrictions to democracy. Everything is possible. Everything can be decided upon democratically, and the people can decide without restrictions about the institutional structure and design and about the borders of its states. Everything is possible if it's done from democracy. And when we talk about this radical democracy, we're talking about a democracy that's opposed to violence. The fourth characteristic is that the non-violence aspect of this process. Any violence goes against the right to decide and against this political principle. So obviously, we could say that we cannot speak about a radical democracy. We cannot defend that position with arms, but we have to go through elections. So that's non-violence. Fifth point, that's very important. You can say that in the 21st century, there is general agreement about the fact that democracy is the best way for government. All the democratic theories give us a clear image and shows us that there is no better way for government. But these same democratic theories don't say anything about how we can define the demos aspect, how we can apply the general rule of democracy, which is the community on which we're going to apply this universally recognized rule, which is the democratic rule. So what's a majority in Catalonia can be a minority in Spain. What's a majority in Spain could be a minority in Europe. So if you apply certain democratic decisions, it'll depend on the group it's applied to, and it depends also on the majority. The results are not going to be exactly the same. It'll depend on the rule that's being applied. Why? Because democracies work, and that would be my sixth point, the need to go beyond the fractures of democracy, because democracies work if nobody is excluded of being able to participate in collective decisions. Majorities and minorities change as time goes by, and we are probably going to be part of some majority at some point in time, because otherwise we would be talking about minorities, permanent minorities. But we can also talk about majorities that have been democratically excluded, and that is one of the problems that we have to overcome in democracy. The right to decide tries to find a solution to this problem. It's not enough defending democracy as such. We have to insist on the demos aspect, the rule of the majority, and that's applied to the main liberal Western democracies that live together with different aspects of this demos, with different territorial minorities that have to be managed in a just and democratic way. And these substatal demos have majorities that have to be represented at the level of the state, and therefore the state has to take into account these minorities that are majority within their own context, because otherwise we would have a majority dictatorship. And precisely in the 21st century, this particular situation that liberal democracies don't give a good solution to these problems, that is where we have evolved, and we have tried to define this right to decide within these substatal communities. The right to decide can only be claimed by those who are democratically excluded and have this wish to become a viable state, to be able to decide about a possible definition of the borders of the state, to go beyond these democratic weaknesses. So I think it's absurd to do what the Spanish state did to try to own this concept. They can't say that the right to decide is mine, and in Spain we say that we already have the right to decide because that's what the constitution says, but it's not true, because we have this impossibility to express these alternative demos aspects. It would be absurd, really, that the big towns, the central towns, want to apply the right to self-determination and to leave the colonies without any rights. That cannot be decided by the central instances only. So therefore, we don't talk about a political principle, but we talk about a political principle for the territorial minorities that have to have recognized rights in the context of the states. My ninth point about the right to decide is the need to distinguish between decide and to have an opinion. The right to have an opinion is not the same thing as the right to decide. All citizens have different possibilities to express their opinions. There are poll surveys, etc. And it would be very expensive to create an electoral system just to express an opinion. I think the political decision has to have political consequences. Therefore, we cannot mix the exercise of the right to decide with asking the populations for its opinion. I think we have to solve the democratic weaknesses, and it's not the same as an opinion poll. And to see what the question or the questions, plural, should be to exercise this right to decide, we have to take into account that the answer must have certain consequences. There's no point that the Catalans wonder whether Spain has to be a federal state or not, because this decision is not in the hands of the Catalans. It could be obviously interesting to know what our opinion is about this subject, but if you present the subject in this manner, it cannot have political consequences. On the contrary, we can ask ourselves whether we want to stay within the state. Do we have this wish? And I'll be finishing now. My 10th point is the legal basis of the right to decide. I said at the beginning that it's not a right that's been positive or that's been reflected or incorporated in an internationally recognized document, but that doesn't mean that the right to decide that's evolving, that's taking shape, does not have a legal basis. This legal basis can be found from 2010 onwards, from the court sentence, the Hague sentence, when it's expressed its ruling about Kosovo. Catalonia and Kosovo are two different situations, but we have certain indication that about values that are internationally recognized. And I would like to remind you when the court, which is the highest instance, says that this unilateral declaration is not legal, but it's got legitimacy. I think 3 universal values are thereby recognized. The value of non-violence that I mentioned previously, democracy, democratic processes to reach such decisions, and the impossibility to reach an agreement between parties in good faith. If no such agreement is reached, if institutional changes cannot be reached from within the system, then there is the possibility to decide, of course, providing that it's being done by non-violence processes, and the court didn't dare give this process a name. It's not to this court to do so, but that's what that's what the right to decide is about. I think the right to decide is being defined by these 10 principles. We can decide, and we can define this principle of the 21st century that will go on evolving, will go on growing, and that can already be found in some other debates that we find between states. And very briefly, because I'm running out of time, I would like to make 3 comments about the Catalonian case, because in the case of Catalonia we cannot explain the demonstration of millions of people without understanding that although we do not have a political analysis of the right to decide, there is a certain analysis that when there is a non-violent process, everything is possible. I'd like to remind you, I'm finishing off now. I'd like to show you a slide, if you allow me to do so.
Yes? And la transparència només em servirà per no oblidar-me, ni que sigui molt ràpidament, dels moments àlgids.
With this slide, I'll be able not to forget the very important moments where the whole of Catalan society demonstrated to claim this right to decide, and this was done at very important moments in time, because we are speaking about a movement that has come from the grassroots, from the people. It's a claim that came from the street, and the politicians have used these arguments in their parliamentary debates. I would just like to remind you that at the moment, the right to decide, which defined as I defined it, as something that is a political framework, something that allows people to gather around. In the 70% of the Catalan MPs define this concept in this way, and several months ago, in March of this year, a declaration was published in favor of this right, with the support of 77% of our MPs. And for me, the most important element has been the social mobilization that allowed us to reach this situation. I would just like to remind you that since February of 2006, the Catalan people are organizing demonstrations and doing things with thousands of people to claim two fundamental things, two basic ideas they're trying to defend. We are a nation, and we have the right to decide. The demonstration, we had a demonstration in 2006, another one in 2007. There was a very complex process of non-official consultations. More than 1 million people took part in this. They voted in more than 500 municipalities in Catalonia to exercise, not legally, but with understanding their right to decide. In June of 2010, there was another big demonstration, and in this case, it was organized by civil society, and all the presidents of the Generalitat of recent history have taken part in this demonstration, and saying that we have the right to decide. And there have been 2 big demonstrations recently. It was another step forward, because we are not being listened to by the Spanish state. In September of 2012, we had 2 demonstrations to say that we want to be part of Europe in a new state. I would like to say, and I'm really finishing now. I've been introduced as an academic, as a theoretical expert. And of course, we can have big discourses from the academic point of view to try and justify theories of secession. And if we base ourselves on different perspectives, the nation, who, and the how is the democratic process. Why? Because in the 21st century we have this principle now, and people don't know about these theories. People that gave each other their hands and formed this chain to alongside the whole of Catalonia do not know these theories. They don't know this, but they know what democracy is, what it's about, and they know what they're not. They're a people without state. They do not want violence. Violence is useless. They know that democracy within the Constitution has got its weaknesses, and they know that there is this principle of the right to decide that is having its first steps before it will be recognized legally, positively, and at an international level, as happened a few years ago with the right to self-determination. I think there is no other better way to talk about these things, about these claims, than the European Parliament, because it's the house of European democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jaume.
Dank je wel, Jaume, voor die presentatie.
From Quebec, and we have over the years watched with great interest events in Quebec in connection with the right to decide. Daniel Turp is a politician and academic, having been a member of the Canadian Federal Parliament between 1997 and 2000, and later a member of the Quebec National Assembly. And in his professorial career in constitutional and international law at the University of Montreal, he's published many texts on sovereignty, particularly in relation to Quebec, but also a number of very well-known publications on the right to decide and on self-determination in an international context. And I know that a number of us have enjoyed his contributions to IFA-hosted events in the past, so I very much welcome Daniel to this event too. Thank you.
Du groupe parlementaire.
Thank you very much for inviting me to attend your event. Dear colleagues, dear friends, people here who represent the peoples of Europe, peoples who are looking for autonomy, are looking for independence. I think it makes sense indeed to be meeting here in the European Parliament and to try and obtain more recognition for the right to decide. I'm very honored, very pleased and happy to be here with you in this particular building of the European Parliament. It's an honor for me to be here and to attend this conference on the right to decide. I've caught a bit of a cold in Paris recently, so you might think that I am, as you know, I may not be a close friend of Josep Carreras, the Catalonian singer. I may have a very deep-sounding voice today, but not because I'm a fan or not because I'm a singer. It's just that, yeah, I've had to deal with the cold weather and the cold wave in France, and that has affected my voice. Sorry about that. I wanted to speak here as a constitutional law and international law professor, more maybe than as a militant of independence, and focus on the legal framework or the legal basis for the concepts that we want to talk about, particularly the right to decide. I'll focus on how we've looked at that in Quebec, and if my slide number 1, yes, can be shown, it does. This is the plan of my presentation. I'll focus first in a short introduction on the right to decide under international law, and I'll give you I'll share with you some important aspects from certain important international documents and covenants, including the United Nations Charter and various international covenants.
Peuple du monde lorsqu'il s'agit de l'indépendance. Et ensuite, vous parlez de la situation particulière en droit canadien et québécois, où on a reconnu le droit de décider du Québec, mais où cette défense du droit de décider est un plébiscite de tous les jours, parce qu'il y en a encore qui contestent la possibilité ou le droit du Québec de décider de son propre avenir.
fight on a daily basis for that right to be recognized, even though you may have had recognition from through a court ruling. You still have to keep fighting to get daily recognition. Let's start maybe with a short historical reminder of the history of Quebec, just to focus on or refocus on the specific context that is ours. The independentist movement was born in Quebec in the 1960s and has mostly been activated by the so-called Parti Québécois, created in 1968 and which won the elections in November 76, November the 15th to be precise, 1976. The elections were won by the Quebec Party. As soon as we got the power, we clearly established our, let's say, the stepping stone that was supposed to lead us to the independence of Quebec. And we adopted a law whereby we were we would be in a position to organize a referendum and through referendum ask whether the people of Quebec wanted to be independent. So the first act that was taken, the first clear decision that was taken was the adoption of that particular law. And through the adoption of that law, we decided that we wanted to be given the possibility and give ourselves the possibility to have a referendum. So we did not ask the Ottawa government to grant us the possibility of organizing a referendum. We grabbed it ourselves. And I think that was a very important decision. That was a key moment in the history of Quebec. And we organized this referendum on the basis of our own rules and on the basis of our own criteria. So we organized the first referendum on May 20th, 1980. You can see the results on screen. Disappointing, of course, 44 in favor, 56 against. And at the time, people said we lost the referendum, but we won the right to decide. And even though we lost, yes, we still won something on the day, which was the freedom to choose and to decide about our own future. I was very disappointed, and many people were very disappointed. And we felt at the time that everything was lost, that we would never have a country that would be ours, because we got that referendum and failed or did not transform, let's say, the try. But I think fighting for independence is something that you need to do on a daily basis. You need to believe in independence to fight for it on a daily basis. And I think if you look at Canada, if you look at the government, the federal government does not take into consideration the fact that 40% in this case of people decided that yes, voted in favor of an independent Quebec nation and country. And simply because a referendum is lost doesn't mean that you have and you can discard or forget or set aside the opinion of 40% of the population. There were various tries then to reform the Canadian Constitution that were unsuccessful, and the Quebec Party was re-elected because the Quebec Party was still something that people believed in. There was then the second referendum of 1995, as you can see nearly there, 49.4% voted yes. That's 50,000 people out of 4 million we missed the target by very little. And I think, and I was talking about this with the Scottish colleague earlier, what was really the success of this referendum is the fact that we were able to mobilize people. 95% of the people went and voted and took part in the referendum. And we believe that the better the participation in any referendum, the more chances you have of succeeding. And again, people were disappointed, and again, people thought, well, we've missed our second chance to get this independent country. And a year ago now, a bit more than a year ago, the Quebec Party was again re-elected, and again the intention is to organize a referendum, the third one, which of course will be successful. Unfortunately, we don't have a majority within the parliament right now, and I don't want to go into the details of how you can organize a referendum, but still there are various criteria that have to be met, and if you don't have a majority in parliament, and the two other parties that have the majority do not want a referendum, so we can't right now initiate a referendum process, but there will be elections soon. Well, there should have taken place this autumn. Our Prime Minister, Mrs. Maura, decided not to go for elections, but there may be elections in the spring of 2014, and then we may have a majority within Parliament, and we may then initiate the third referendum process, and that one will be, third time lucky. That one will be the good one, and that one will be a success. That's the introduction I wanted to present to you. Let's move on to international law now.
So I think it's important to recall all this before having it about the law of Quebec or of Canada. We have to remember that it's the Charter of the United Nations stating the right of people to decide for themselves, so their equality and the right to decide for themselves. So it is one of the goals targeted by the United Nations. And say the people, it's not say the colonial people, I'd say, no, it's the way it was interpreted that way. But the interpretation by the General Meeting tended to broaden the scope of that law. But what's even more important for your people and my people is always to recall Article 1 of the Pact of Social and Cultural Rights. So both pacts implying and stating in the first article, because it's very important, it's really a fundamental right, even for implementing individual rights to be found in those international treaties. If you read them, you can see that all people have the right to decide for themselves and to decide freely about the political status, to be independent, to be autonomous, to have autonomy within a federation or a quasi-federation, and to develop freely in social and cultural matters. So we have to reassert the law of our people, of our nations, to decide for themselves and to choose their own political status. And even if we've always been looking for this within the United Nations and within other organizations, even if it's always been tried to restrict that right, the text remains, and the text is very clear. So meaning that all peoples have the right to decide for themselves. And as far as you are concerned here in Europe, I think it's very interesting to say that from the 1976, your countries, the countries in which your nations are, so those nations, participating nations, said they were going to respect that right to decide for themselves and for the people to dispose of themselves concerning the international law. There's also a reference to the territories and so on, and the territorial integrity, like in the case of Kosovo, for example. But have a look at what is written in the final act, and you should refer to this. In virtue of that law, all the people always, I repeat it, have a right to determine when and how they want. So it's when they want and the way they want to decide about their internal and external status. So meaning they're allowed to become independent if they want to. So after the war, we had Charter of Paris as accepted by the OECD, concerning the autonomy of people in virtue of the Charter of the United Nations. But there was again a reference to the territorial integrity. But don't forget, we do have a base in international law for what we are saying, and we state that this has a global value, meaning the right to decide exists within international law, is underpinned by international treaties or charters, and the nations in the countries in which your nation is have ratified or have approved all those international instruments. They've cooperate to all those different works, and so they've accepted the principle of the Charter of Paris. So it's very important for us as people demanding that right. So we give our interpretation of those texts and the way they can be implemented for our nations and people. So the Kosovo and Serbia were very interesting to us, because Serbia managed to convince states that were member states of the United Nations General Meeting to give an advice of to the International Court of Justice, asking if the demand for independence was lawful. Do you think Serbia thought that the International Court of Justice would render the kind of judgment it did? Not at all. Why? Because what did the International Court of Justice say? That it was that it had been clear that during that period, so the after colonization, that the international rights did in no way forbid a statement of independence. And if you read the last sentence of that paragraph, saying that the practice in the state does not show that there would be new rules forbidding that kind of unilateral statement of independence. So if in a few months Catalonia declares unilaterally its independency, the ICG told us in 2010 that it would not be illegal according to the international law, and it's quite an important issue. If our people have to go that fast, if they have to declare independence in a unilateral way because the country refuses to negotiate, though the nations voted for independence, or to have or for MPs wanting independence, so that unilateral statement on the declaration won't be unlawful according to international law. So it's quite a big progress for us and for our people, and we have to repeat that to the people who say we don't have the right to declare unilaterally our independence to Spain, to Canada. You watch Luck here in the UK, where when I'm in Scotland, Wales, you have the right to do that. Maybe it's easier for you to do that, but that kind of action has to be reiterated, and we have to remind the ICG of the Kosovo case. So let's get back to Quebec and within Canada. So a few years before, so after the referendum of 1995, we almost won. So we did not want to miss another opportunity, and hoping we had nearly won. So as we had no argument left, when you have 49% voting for, it means that all sorts of threats of losing your retirement scheme or whatever, of getting poorer and so on. Well, we've been trying to convince the court that they've been trying to convince the court that the Quebec had not the right to become independent. So the opinion of the Supreme Court of Canada was asked, it's the higher instance, and the government of Canada was quite negatively surprised, because to the question, has Quebec the right to separate itself? So they said there's no remedial secession, but later on in the arrest, the international acknowledgement is very important and could make some actions lawful even if they were not lawful in se. But when the court had to render a judgment, you can read here the most important except. So it's the paragraph 92 saying that right, the word right is mentioned to try to carry out secession if the majority of the population votes for, as long as this majority also respects the rights of other people. So it's explicitly mentioned that they have a right to secession, and on what ground it's very important, on two constitutional underlying principles, the one of democracy and the principle of federalism that can be exported. I was discussing with our friend from Bavaria. It's also federalism in Germany within democracy. Well, on the base of those principles, according to the Supreme Court, it means your people also have the right to carry out a secession. Would be the same in the UK, in Canada, in Spain, whatsoever. That's the reason why that reference to the secession of Quebec is very important and has a much bigger scope than only in Canada. So you know that government that lodged a complaint before the court, the Supreme Court, and got as an answer that Quebec has the right to become independent if there is a clear majority, did not, of course, love the rendered judgment. So a few years after, they adopted the Clarity Act. That went to neutralize what the court had also created as counterpart to the right to secession, meaning an obligation to negotiate. So the Supreme Court says if Quebec wants to become independent and to vote for independence, it is compulsory to negotiate about that secession. So we did not approve it, of course. So we've adopted clarifying acts saying in which way Canada is not going to negotiate. It is an act about non-negotiation. So you can see some provisions here, Article 3, 1 and 2. So these are provisions that are quite interesting, because the first one acknowledges, but implicitly, the rights of secession, saying that Quebec cannot do it unilaterally, meaning Quebec has to negotiate about frontiers, the rights of the people, the protection of minorities, and also the problem of modifying the constitution. This was voted by the parliament and was there as a deputy of the Bloc Québécois, and 2/3 of the MPs voted against this, saying that law is inadmissible for us. It's your act, it's your rules, they're not ours. Our rules are different. We base ourselves on consulting the citizens, but anyway, this act exists and aims at discouraging the people from Quebec, telling them, you are not the only one to decide. We are a parliament, and we are going to decide with the other districts and so on. Even if your majority is clear, we are going to decide, and we can do that by modifying the constitution. And we reply by saying modifying the constitution in virtue of something that was imposed to us in 1982. So it is your procedure, your amendment procedure, though it can't be implemented and it's inadmissible. We're not going to accept that our independence would depend from your parliament. For example, that one province out of 10 could say that they disagree, that it would be enough for us not to get our independence. So another very important act in the story of Quebec is that when we had that federal law, so our General Assembly adopted the law on the exercise of fundamental rights and the prerogatives of the people of Quebec, in which it is said that the people of Quebec has the right to dispose of itself and to decide in virtue of the principle of the equality of people to dispose of themselves. It's a little bit of our declaration of sovereignty, a little bit like in Catalonia, that was adopted in May 2013. So it's very important. And as we said, we stated that if or when the citizens in Quebec vote for a referendum, what is important is the majority of the votes, meaning 50% plus one vote. So what we said when we discussed clarity concerning the majority, it's simply 50% plus one and not other rules, for example, 55 like in Montenegro or 66. Giving the power to majority to make it impossible for a new nation to be born. So that law, that act, is being now contested before the Constitutional Court. And so a few months after it was adopted in 2001. Constitutional Court, the case was brought before the Constitutional Court, saying this was against the Constitution. So the government of Quebec said it was non-admissible. It lost. Then there was another demand as amended, and recently the government of Canada, instead of waiting for the court's decision, decided to intervene voluntarily, saying, well, it's okay, but maybe we can't go as far as letting Quebec making a statement of independence. So they just or the court would have to say that it's inadmissible. So two weeks ago, Canada lodged that statement. It's integrating into a law process. So they want to attenuate those provisions. The whole political class of Quebec, so all the political parties said they were against the decision, and they've adopted the motions. Nobody voted against. So to reiterate the principles of that act of Quebec. And you have here the text of the motion as adopted on the 23rd of October, so a few days from here. So the Member of Parliament stood up one after the other. So 114 to say, as you can read it, that the General Assembly said unanimously the fundamental principles as stated that act, saying that the people from Quebec have the right to decide about their future and to decide themselves about their political status. And they even had it unanimously. So even the other parties for federalism that are not for or in favor of independence, but they are in favor of the right to decide. Look at what they said. So it's they say that the General Assembly should condemn the intrusion of the Canadian government within the democracy of Quebec by its will to invalidate the contested provisions concerning Quebec. So your parliaments could just do the same. It would be good that they would do something against national government wanting to do something against other nations from Catalonia or whatever. And that the nations can defend themselves as being a people and having a right to independence. I wanted to share my experience with you and to tell you that freedom, independence, the right to decide is a democratic right for the people of Europe, and it's from your ally from Quebec.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for that. It's my great pleasure now to move on to one of my favourite subjects, Scotland, in the context of the right to decide. And I know very well that there is a lot of interest here and across Europe in what's happening in Scotland at the moment, where we have the right to decide. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce an SNP colleague to update us on the situation in Scotland. Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh has recently been re-elected as a member of the SNP National Executive. She is SNP National Women's Officer. She is chair of the Scottish Asian Women's Association. She is an actress. She is a mother of 4. She is a lawyer and a partner in a Scottish law firm. Added to all of that, this summer she was selected as one of the SNP candidates for the European elections next year, which I hope will lead to us seeing a great deal more of her in these corridors. But also Tasmina is a member of the advisory board of Yes Scotland, which is the community-based campaign organisation which is striving to win Scotland's referendum, which will be held next year. Tasmina.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you also to the IFA Group President, Jill Evans, for inviting me here today. Good morning, friends. Can I start by saying what an honour and a pleasure it is to be invited to speak here today. As a candidate in next year's European elections, to be in this great and historic city, this administrative and political capital of Europe, excites and engages me, and I hope what I have to say to you today excites and engages you too. You won't be surprised to hear that I intend to talk about Scotland and its current journey towards political independence. For those who aren't fully familiar with its history, ours is one of the oldest nations in Europe. Our flag, the Saltire, can be traced back to the year 832. Scotland's relationship with England, its larger and sometimes conquering neighbour, has often been a fractious one. Yet, if there are 2 character traits Scotland is famous for, they are pride and defiance in the face of an oppressor. In 1320, during the First War of Independence, the country's nobles gathered to sign the Declaration of Arbroath, one of the most important expressions of freedom and independence in our continent's history, and centuries later, a profound influence on the American Constitution. I don't want this speech to be a history lesson, but the words of that declaration, sealed in wax and sent to Pope John XXII at Avignon, are perhaps one of the greatest expressions of human rights ever written. They resonate down the centuries and still find expression today. I quote, "For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, Never will we, on any conditions, be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. Now, it's amazing the effect a love letter can have, though, and things did get better. England and Scotland let their wounds heal, well, some of them anyway, and the odd skirmish and royal beheading didn't stop a union of the crowns of Scotland and England taking place in 1603. The Act of Union, which joined the two parliaments and formed a unitary state and single market in a sort of precursor to the EU, came into being in 1707. Scotland was not meant to be assimilated into this new Great Britain, but to be an equal partner within it. And indeed, it has kept its own legal system and distinctive national church, both enshrined in the treaty to this day. Inevitably, though, the larger entity overwhelmed the smaller. Scots did not necessarily object to this. For instance, they played an instrumental role in building and running the British Empire, as well as in 2 world wars. Fundamentally, this political settlement survived largely unchallenged until the second half of the 20th century, when there was a gradual reawakening of Scottish national identity and a growing interest in independence. There are 2 very distinct elements to the Scottish autonomy movement, which set it apart from nationalist campaigns in other parts of the world. Firstly, it is, and always has been, completely non-violent. And secondly, it is rooted not in emotional idealism, but in the pragmatic aim of building a better and more cohesive society. In short, it's not about independence for its own sake, but it's a key to unlocking the door to forging a better country. My own party, the Scottish National Party, 80 years old next year, has long driven the agenda on independence. The SNP's revival in the 1970s led to a national debate about re-establishing the Scottish Parliament, which, after an abortive and frankly rigged referendum in 1979, was finally delivered in 1999, a decision validated by the Scottish people in a referendum. Since then, the transformation in Scottish polity has been remarkable. The Parliament, dominated since its inception by the centre-left, has won the trust of the people and has wide-ranging powers over education, health, justice, the environment, enterprise, culture, rural affairs and much more besides. However, its remit remains limited. It lacks power of decision-making over critical areas of competence. Key decisions affecting Scots in areas such as economic policy, welfare and benefits, defence and foreign affairs and the Constitution are still taken by politicians in Westminster. More and more, Scots are seeing this existing devolved settlement as inadequate. As their Parliament has matured, so have their expectations and their confidence. There is a strong and growing clamour for full independence, a clamour which will be tested and hopefully rewarded in next year's referendum on this very issue. The road to the referendum has been a long one, though it has picked up speed in recent years. The establishment of the Scottish Parliament allowed the SNP to become a major political force for the first time and moved the focus of decision-making from London to Edinburgh. The rules of the new Parliament, drafted when Tony Blair was in power, were meant to ensure that no party achieved an overall majority, so forcing consensus through coalition. And sure enough, the first 2 Scottish administrations were an amalgam of Labour and the Liberal Democrats. But then, in the 3rd parliamentary elections in 2007, the SNP won the most seats, albeit by only 1, and decided to press ahead without a coalition partner as a minority government. This arrangement held for a full parliamentary term, though the lack of a parliamentary majority did mean that progress could not be made on a referendum bill during this mandate. Then, in 2011, there was dramatic change. A proven record of competence in government, the powerful personality of the First Minister Alex Salmond, and the party's imaginative vision of Scotland's future chimed with the electors in a way which led the SNP to win a landslide victory. The party was so successful that it won an overall majority. Despite a system designed to prevent this from ever happening, we broke the mould. The result of this absolute majority is that the SNP government has been able to implement its entire programme with a referendum on independence as its flagship offering to the electorate. The terms of the ballot paper have been agreed. It will be a simple yes/no to the question, should Scotland be an independent country? And the date of the poll is fixed for the 18th of September 2014. I mentioned a moment ago that Scotland's independence movement is driven by aspirations to create an open, progressive, modern European society rather than by blood and soil nationalism. It is about pragmatism, not history. With this in mind, both the Scottish and UK governments have been determined to underpin the integrity of this referendum and to define its exact legal status. This has been achieved through a critical concordat called the Edinburgh Agreement. Signed in October 2012 by the Scottish First Minister Alex Salmond and the UK Prime Minister David Cameron, this sets the terms of the referendum, including giving 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote in it. Importantly, it also commits both governments to respect the outcome, meaning that if there is a yes vote, there will be no attempt by the government in London to block the will of the Scottish people. So with the yes result, the way will be open for Scotland to begin negotiations with Westminster on the transition to independence. Our aim is to have those talks concluded within 18 months, meaning that the first elections for an independent Scottish Parliament will be held at the end of the current term in May 2016. That, we believe, is an entirely realistic timetable. Discussions with the UK government over the terms of independence are hugely important, but they are, of course, not the only discussions we will have. We fully intend to retain our membership of the European Union. Scotland is and always has been a European nation. I know that here, at the very heart of the European Union and throughout the Member States, there is a certain irritation and weariness at the UK's deliberate confrontational attitude to the EU, its refusal to engage and sometimes childish petulance. Scotland does not share the UK government's destructive and embarrassing mindset. Scots have a lot to contribute to the EU and a lot to gain from their continued membership. It's not just the Scottish Government which wants to play and benefit from a constructive role in Europe. Public opinion favours this too. Now, I'm not pretending that we don't have our Eurosceptics, and I'm also not pretending that everyone in Scotland thinks all is wonderfully rosy in the European garden. Of course it isn't. The case remains for reform of some of the key aspects of EU policy and governments, and we will support that reform. And we will always act in Scotland's best interests, which we will fearlessly and tenaciously defend when necessary. Our fellow Member States would expect that, and we know they will respect us for it, as we would respect them. But we will always negotiate in the spirit of goodwill and cooperation, and within the framework of being a good European neighbour and citizen. We want the EU to work for everyone. Small nations have always historically commanded respect within the European institutions, and there's a strong argument that they punch above their weight here in Brussels. Scotland certainly has plenty to bring to the table. For instance, our universities lead the world in terms of quality of teaching and research, and are engaged in programmes which directly help to improve the quality of life of Europe's people and boost its economy and society. Our oil reserves are larger than any other country in the EU, and with independence, we will help to secure our national prosperity for generations to come, through a sovereign wealth oil fund, an idea already helping to successfully underpin Norway's economy. Scotland is also fully aware that stewardship of natural resources also brings responsibility. Despite the fact that remaining North Sea oil and gas reserves are set to last decades or more and reinforce Scotland's existing position as a global centre of innovation and excellence in difficult recovery in deep water technologies, we are already thinking of life beyond hydrocarbons. Scotland already has some of the most challenging protective climate change legislation in the world and is a global leader in renewable energy. Not in solar power, admittedly, much as we'd like to. We don't really get enough sun for that. We'll leave that to our southern European cousins. What we do have a lot of is wind. In fact, we're the windiest country in Europe. Please don't let that put you off coming to Scotland on holiday. All that fresh air is very good for you. But our blustery weather does present us with a truly massive commercial opportunity. We have a quarter of Europe's wind resource and also a quarter of the tidal energy potential, along with 10% of its potential wave power resource. By any measure, that makes us a major player in the kind of clean, green energy from politically stable sources which will fuel Europe in the future. But we don't just provide to Europe, we are part of Europe. We're already in the club. We Scots are citizens of the European Union, and overwhelmingly we want and intend to remain so. Opinion polls show that more than half of us want to stay in the EU, and that with independence, that figure would rise to above 60%. We are absolutely aware of the benefits that Europe's freedom of movement, both of goods and of people, brings, and we want to retain those benefits. Freedom of movement rules don't just give Scots a fantastic opportunity to holiday, live, work, marry and build families in other member states. They allow EU citizens from other parts of the Union to come to Scotland too. Some 150,000 workers and students from a range of EU countries have chosen to do so. They have been welcomed and have enriched our culture, our economy and our society. Scotland is a better place for their presence, and they too will be able and welcome to vote in next year's referendum. I wouldn't want to give the impression that we take EU membership for granted. We know that existing treaties have to be respected and that other member states will need to agree. Unfortunately, it is difficult to get a precise opinion on our membership from the European Commission, not because the Scottish Government can't provide the details, but because it requires the UK Government as the existing member state to join with us in making the submission, and it has unfortunately so far not consented to do so. Nevertheless, we will work diligently to acquire the agreement of other member states. Our plan is to make a notification of intent to the EU quickly after we secure a yes vote. That will signal our intention to continue Scotland's membership of the EU after independence, with negotiations to start as soon as possible. Some of our opponents question why an independent Scotland should be a member of the EU, but surely a better question is, why shouldn't we? As I've said, we are EU citizens. We apply EU law and policy. We have already demonstrated our willingness and capacity through our existing devolved Scottish Government and Parliament to transpose and implement EU legislation. We would be a net contributor to the EU budget, and we would seek to be an enthusiastic and constructive partner, contributing to Europeans' development and growth. But surely the strongest arguments aren't those about law and process. They are those about reality and common sense. We are in the EU and we don't want to leave. Why would anyone want to throw out a small, engaged, bold new country which has Europe in its DNA and has so much to contribute to all of the EU institutions? There is another dimension here. As I have explained, Scotland is a pro-European country. The rest of the UK and London government took a very different approach. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, has chosen to engage in low politics and tap into the populist well of mainly English Eurosceptic, anti-immigrant public opinion. In order to appease voters attracted by the far-right anti-EU UK Independence Party, a grouping which threatens his own Conservative Party in England but barely registers in the polls in Scotland, Mr Cameron has said he will call a referendum on the UK's membership of the European Union in 2017. The EU referendum is unwanted and unwelcome in Scotland, and it provides another imperative for Scots to vote yes in our independence poll next year. If we fail to do so, we could find ourselves being dragged out of Europe against our will. But I am confident that we will not be faced with this nightmare scenario, because there will be a yes vote in Scotland next September. Opinion polls show that the more Scots learn about independence, the more inclined they are to vote for it. We will have to work hard to win over the electors, and we cannot for a moment be complacent. But a majority for yes is undoubtedly there to be won. I'm an advisory board member of Yes Scotland, the official campaign for a yes vote next year. Yes Scotland is building the largest community-based campaign in Scottish history and has secured the support of various political parties in Scotland, and indeed individuals of no political persuasion whatsoever, but who strive for a better future than our present. This debate will be won in communities, workplaces, schools, universities and online. And by the time polling takes place, I'm hoping my own life will have changed. As I said at the beginning, I'm standing as a candidate for the SNP in the European Parliament elections in May, and I hope that I'll secure the number of votes necessary to allow me to join our existing team here in Brussels. It is a fantastic prospect, and I really hope that the Scottish people will allow me to see much more of you come next summer. Some people might think of me as a nationalist. Am I? I'm not sure, in this multicultural and interconnected world, what nationalism is these days. No one could doubt my love for the country I'm so honoured and pleased to call home. But I'd rather call myself an internationalist. I am a mix of cultures. My dad is Indian, my mum Welsh. I was born in London and raised in Edinburgh. I'm proudly Scottish, proudly Asian, proudly Muslim, and proudly European. And I'd like to think I'm doing my tiny bit, as we all are, to build a better world. And I'm a mum, and that drives me too, because like every parent, I want the best for my children. I want them to grow up in a Scotland and a Europe which offers them the opportunity to flourish and be the best they can be. I want a Scotland and a Europe that protects their rights, guards their dignity, offers them outstanding social protections if they need them, and embeds in them deep-seated values of fairness, tolerance, liberty, compassion, equality and public service. And I want them to be part of a continent stretching from the glittering night skies of the Arctic Circle to the cobalt seas of the Mediterranean, which they can truly call their own. It's their Europe. It's my Europe. It's Scotland's Europe. And it's a Europe which doesn't just need what we have, it also needs what we are. Say, come all ye home with freedom. We are going to win this referendum, and we are going to join you back in the family of nations to which we belong, inshallah. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you very much indeed for that, and indeed thank you to all of our panellists in this first session. If you have the morning's programme in front of you, you'll see that we optimistically offered to have some time for discussion and debate. You'll also see on the programme that we're due to move on to the next panel at 11 o'clock. And I propose that we do move on to the next panel now, because although we started a little bit late, we can't run late at the end because we have interpretation for a fixed period of time. So with thanks to all of you, thanks to all of our panellists for this session, can I ask the Chair and the panellists for our next session to make as swift and smooth a transition as possible so that we can resume the presentations, and then we will take as many questions and debate contributions as we possibly can after that. Thank you very much.
No, pero podemos. Yo no tengo confianza para eso. ¿Por? Con los que están hablando y eso. ¿Qué pasa, tío? Con todo el mundo, ¿no? Me mola el plan, me mola el plan.
Y voy a pedir siempre
¿Tú lo vas con Nano?
el password y tengo para mi Altiero.
Joder, dama. ¿San dizute haber nahi duzu? Gratio. Zergatik? Eta zer egon da jende guztiari demikrazioa berarekin? Baina produkta baleta eta priorizatu egon dira. ¿Sabes la del pello ayer, no? Te perdí el avión.
Ara farem adoració com a inici.
És audiovisual,
De promoure.
Sí, sí, parla.
O sigui, no ho fer, el memori que fa quan entra.
No, tota la família a parlar així. No, però mai ho havia vist així. Sí, tots els de fora, tothom està fora. Sí, està tot fora.
És la primera visita des que va ser.
Estan tots, estan tots.
estaría bien. Uy, es que está faltando de fuerza. Sería
¿Molesto aquí? No importa, no importa.
Bien. Merci de regagner vos...
Would you be so kind as to be seated? We're going to start with the second part of this morning. And it's my pleasure to welcome with Mark de Mesmaker, the main actors and players of self-determination, who's already full within autonomous independency. So we'll have my former colleague that we've appreciated so much. It was a pity for us when he left the European Parliament, but I think that in Catalonia they were very pleased about this, because since then the situation has become quite different. So it's Mr. Oriol Junqueras. So it became very different for Esquerra Republica de Catalunya within the Independence Party in Catalonia. After that we'll have Xavier Venture from the Bloque Nacionalista Gallego, and after him we'll have Pazzi Zabaleta, who will have it about the situation in the Basque Country. So this is our program. Quite full, and we're very impatient to listen to you. So how many minutes? That's a good question. About 20 minutes? I think you've got about 20 minutes, yeah.
Bon dia a tothom.
Good morning to all of you.
Del públic. Intento explicar algunes obvietats.
Voy a intentar ser breve. I'll try to be brief. There are some things that are obvious, and I'll try to explain better what's happening in Catalonia from a European perspective. First of all, the right for self-determination in Europe, it's a current right. It's an habitual right, and we've seen that throughout the 20th century, half of the states that exist now in Europe became independent. And if there's something that is a trademark of the current situation, we see that in the 19th and 20th century, that trademark would be how these states were born. So self-determination is a right that has been exercised in different ways, and also in a current habitual way. So it's a normal thing. The aspiration Catalonians have is to join this club, whereby societies decide democratically their future. And within the background of Western democracies, liberal democracies, we've also seen self-determination processes in Ireland in 1922, Iceland, the case of Norway in 1904, for example. So self-determination has taken place not only within the European context, but also within the framework of Western democracies. Currently, we are convinced in Catalonia, we are certain, the Catalonian society is certain that a self-determination process, that independence, that through democracy is important. The way we would end up being independent through this process, and this must be done within the framework of the European institutions. Nobody in Europe thinks that Scotland would be outside of the EU. That's not foreseen by anybody. Nobody thinks that if Flanders became independent, it would be outside of the EU, among other reasons, because the capital then of the European Union would be outside of the EU. So that's unthinkable by anybody. That hypothetical situation is presented by the Spanish political parties, and they do it assuming that they would veto this possibility. They would veto the fact that Catalonia would be in the EU. And from a legal perspective, there's not any treaty, there's not any European directive which points out the potential exclusion of a group of people based on the fact that they've exercised their democratic right. And we are talking about the basic democratic right, which is the right to vote. The Catalonians are EU citizens, and we are convinced that the European Union has to first respect the democratic rights of its citizens. Then there's also a practical issue. Never mind how much the Spanish state may want to forbid things, the fact is that there are economic interests that link Catalonia to the rest of the European Union, and I'm talking about big multinationals as an example. And bearing that in mind, it's very difficult to conceive a veto by the Spanish state. The big multinationals that are now in Catalonia are not at all interested in Catalonia leaving the European institutions. So from a practical point of view, there are a lot of incentives for Catalonia to be part of the European Union. There's something else that I'd like to point out. Now, when within the European institutions, there's talk about recognizing the 4 basic rights: free movement of people, the free movement of goods, services and capital, with states that are outside of the European Union. So this idea is there without giving those people, the Spanish people, the right to vote. The Spanish state could vote against that decision. So there are tools, there are legal tools that would allow for Catalonia to continue being within the European Union. On the other hand, Catalonian society, it's also it tends to be on the side of the European Union. No Eurosceptic political party in Catalonia could blossom. So that we don't have that. Catalonia, it's pro-Europe, and ourselves, what we want is to continue being part of the European Union. And I'd like to say a few things about what's happening now in Catalonia. There's an important mobilization that has taken place, and it's been there for a long time. And it's difficult to see in other places a similar type of mobilization. We are talking about 2 million people that went onto the streets in Barcelona and that were present in the roads all over Catalonia. So it's very difficult to find something of that scale in another European country. We have strong social presence, strong social mobilization, and this is the main strength of the democratic process Catalonia is going through at the moment. And that's also our main hope, because that social mobilization has got direct political implications. There are groups that are in favor of the right to vote. Among them, there's Convergencia Union, which until now has been the majority party, and then Esquerra Republicana, the second party, which according to the polls could become the #1 party. And also we've got Iniciativa per Catalunya, which lags a bit behind. But the 2 first ones, they've got a majority in the Catalonian parliament, and also they're very present at a municipal level. Catalonia has got about 900 mayors. Out of them, 700, more than 70%, are affiliated to either Convergencia Union or Esquerra Republicana. Therefore, there is a majority in parliament with these 2 parties that is present not only in the parliament, but it's present in the different institutional forum. So that's why we ask Catalonians to mobilize, so that these political parties have got enough power so that this process is achieved. And we'd like this to happen as soon as possible. There's also a commitment that came from Parliament and that was ratified by 2/3 of a majority in Parliament. So basically 2/3 of the Parliament want for a referendum to take place in 2014. That is the commitment. That's what we want. And we will do everything that is in our hands so that we achieve it. You may be interested also to know that according to the polls, if the elections were held now, Esquerra Republicana would win, but Esquerra Republicana doesn't have as a prime objective to win the next elections. The Esquerra Republicana wants is to support the current government so that we could conclude with this democratic process we are involved in. So we don't have the intention of calling for early elections. Basically, what we want is to support the government to go through this democratic process and to achieve it. And we are also convinced that that's what Catalonians want. If things go this way, we will manage to achieve it, in spite of the fact that the Spanish government is making it very as difficult to us as they can. But democracy is above the constitutional framework, and that's what we found also in the different rulings from the international, the Hague Court, the International Justice Court, which has set some case law, which are the basis of the international law, where we can see that that borders can be altered by democratic means, that democracy can, in the end of the day, change the legal framework. And under no circumstances, this legal framework should restrain democracy, because if there is legislation that says that democracy is illegal, that law would be anti-democratic. So basically, democracy is the core element of any interpretation of international law, especially within the framework of the European Union. That's why we are convinced, we are certain that we will find the way for Catalonians to express their view.
Merci, Oriol. Et donc, je...
Thank you, Oriol. I'm giving the floor to Xavier Rents.
Buen día. Buen día a todas y a todos. Ale, por organizar esta sesión tan importante sobre o dereito a decidir, un dereito fundamental para todos os povos de Europa. Quero agradecer a Ale darme a oportunidade de estar aquí por segunda vez no Parlamento Europeo falando de cuestións importantes para o noso país, para Galicia, xustamente porque tuve a ocasión de estar no ano 2003 representando a plataforma Nunca Máis, que foi un grande movimento social que se creou no noso país en resposta á catástrofe do accidente do Prestige no ano 2002, xustamente no mes de novembro de 2002. Naquela comparecencia diante da Comisión Parlamentaria Europea sobre os accidentes marítimos, tuvemos a oportunidade de explicar como o accidente do Prestige significou algo tamén para as institucións galegas. Significou que o goberno central de José María Aznar naquela ocasión humillou.
José María Aznar humiliated our country, imposing certain criteria that was catastrophic for that accident that was produced at sea with terrible consequences, and that we still see the results these days. In 2003, we also saw a process starting in Spain, a new political process. We call it the process of reclaiming centralism in Spain, And that was the strongest process that we have lived up to now. And in 2003, it meant a humiliation of our institutions because of this accident with the prestige. It also meant the start of a new centralization process by the central Spanish state. We're living the consequences now, and it's one of the main reasons that gives strength to all nationalist movements that we see in Galicia, in the Basque Country, in Catalonia. We're all against this centralization process, and I think we are claiming for our right to decide, and we are against this new centralization, Spanish centralization process. But I'd like to talk about the historical process of in Galicia. Galicia, as many as you might know, was one of the first kingdoms in the European Middle Ages. After that, we have a long history that I'm not going to detail here, but Galicia was part of the Castilian crown, but the claim for independence is has 2,070 years, but it's always been a claim for a democratic process as well. We have two important elements in this process. First of all, the first important element was around 1840, and in the 19th century, during the Liberal Revolution, particularly in 1846, and the central government repressed it violently and killed a lot of people, a lot of the protesters, and it brought about a lot of repression. Therefore, these aspirations didn't die. But during decades, it was put to rest. During decades, this nationalist spirit began to grow. That was the second half of the 20th century, and particularly when in 1918, and we are going to have the 95th anniversary, these aspirations are confirmed. This process that reappeared during the Franco dictatorship in the 60s is based on this claim for sovereignty that was so characteristic for the situation at the beginning of the 20th century in Galicia. But the most important aspect that I would like to talk about is Spain's reaction vis-a-vis these nationalist aspirations of the different nations that form the Spanish nation, Galicia, the Basque Country, and Catalonia. There were different responses. There were repressive movements, dictatorships, and on the other hand, there were statutes for autonomy during the brief periods of democracy during the Second Republic and with the 78 Constitution. But in all cases, there has been a resistance by the Spanish state to recognize the nations that are part of this, the Spanish state. Galicia, the Basque Country, and Catalonia, they have been ignored by the Spanish state, and as a consequence, we do not have a recognition in the constitution. There's no recognition of this right to decide in the Spanish constitution. At the moment, there is this blockage from the 78 constitution, the constitution that was drawn up in a transition moment, coming out of the dictatorship. It was a process that was accompanied by the army and all the people that inherited the dictatorship. So in this context and with the setting up of the 1978 Constitution, quite a few elements made some progress possible. But at the same time, the recognition of Galicia, Basque Country and Catalonia, that was being ignored. They didn't have the right to decide or the right to say we are a nation. Autonomous governments were set up, but their competences were very limited. And any movement to move from autonomy to independence or self-determination was always blocked by the Spanish constitution, because the Spanish state considered that the Spanish people has its sovereignty, and therefore it blocks the right to decide in Galicia, in the Basque Country and in Catalonia. The main proposals that have been made to achieve this multi-nation state have not been successful. Both in the Basque Country, the statute in Catalonia, both intents were completely ignored by the central government in Madrid. And the idea is to do away with this restrictive 78 constitutions and the attitude from the central parties in Madrid. Therefore, the parties in the Basque Country, in Catalonia and in Galicia made a proposal to introduce an element in Spanish legislation, the right to self-determination. But the central parties did not want to approve this initiative to introduce in the Spanish legislation this basic democratic right. Therefore, we consider that we have to find other options. What options do we have as a nation, as a people? Peoples that these days are under the Spanish state. There are two options. Either we achieve through negotiation this right to decide or the self-determination, or we can claim it unilaterally through a referendum. The Bloque Nacionalista Gallego consider that it's very important to build up this right to decide and to conquer the space through democracy, through democratic processes. We think all the democratic and political sensibilities and tendencies that are in Europe should convince the central Spanish state, the big central Spanish parties, that this is an element, a basic element of democracy, this right to decide. And therefore we consider, and Galicia considers, that this claim for the right to decide, the sovereignistic aspirations are something basic. It's a recognition of a basic right. At the same time, this self-determination, this possibility to govern yourself, those are essential elements to achieve social progress and economic growth, which is what we want for our societies. We consider that the crisis of the neoliberal model that we're going through at this time shows that the peoples have to take the initiative, basing themselves on these basic elements, trying to achieve economic growth for their countries and to guarantee a social and territorial cohesion on our continent. Because this complete liberalization that is developed through the markets, if that destroys the economies of the peripheral areas in Europe, that is going to destroy our common future in Europe. It's going to destroy our social cohesion in Europe in the future. Therefore, it's essential that this right to decide, which is a democratic right, is being recognized, and the right to exercise self-government, to manage all affairs that are important for the nation. One way to have a more cohesive world is building up a world without excessive polarizations at the social level and at the territorial level as well. That's our basic objective for our country, for our citizens. But at the moment, we're seeing a strategy from the Spanish central government which is going in the opposite direction. The direction that the Spanish government has chosen, the Spanish government is directed by the People's Party, is looking for a new centralization of the economic system and the political system as well. And that goes against the European freedoms and a Europe that makes the progress possible of the different economies in the peripheral areas in Europe. Galicia admires the developments that peoples have gone through in the last decades and that claimed their independence, and that were the experience of these new states that were created in Europe in the last 2 decades is a fantastic experience, and I think we can all learn from it. Galicians in particular, but the whole of Europe can learn from the advantages of this kind of processes that makes reconciliation possible, because that is the way to recognize yourself within diversity. That's why we are very admirative of the experience of these new states that have been created, that are being consolidated, and we're convinced that the new political momentum that will start after the European elections will mean an important change so that Europe, and in particular the European Union, can go ahead recognizing the nations, the stateless nations that today are a part of the European Union. That's why the European elections are a golden opportunity to progress, both in Galicia, Basque Country, and Catalonia, and other stateless nations that will be able to consolidate themselves, defending the right to decide in the new European Parliament and in the other European institutions. It's going to be a big opportunity in Spain to achieve progress for the forces that are defending sovereignty and to solve the crisis in Spain. This is our project that we're working on at the political level, institutional level, at the level of trade unions, and we have set up a citizens platform called Por la Soberanía. It wants the participation of all Galician forces to achieve this right to decide, and it's a process that has been gathering speed over the last few months, and we hope that it will be successful after the next European elections, and we hope that Galicia is being recognized as a nation that is able to take its own decisions. Thank you.
Merci bien, et la parole.
Thank you very much. Mr. Zawaita, you have the floor.
Agur guztioi, buenos días a todas y a todos.
Good morning to everybody. Thank you also to the European Free Alliance for giving us this opportunity. We think that Euskal Herria, as a nation, should have the right to decide, which is a democratic right, and also we have the desire and the will to exercise this right. Based on the comments I've heard, I'm thankful for giving me the floor, but also out of political responsibility, we must express the peculiarities, not always positive peculiarities, that we experience in Euskal Herria. So limitations that we have that hinder us from having the right to decide in a democratic way. So I will say something obvious that has already been said earlier. People in Basque people, either in the French Republic or in the two autonomous regional governments in Spain, in Navarra and the Basque Country, we are European citizens. We have the nationality of the state where we belong, but we reivindicate, or we claim, also we are European citizens. It's obvious. This is an obvious statement, but from different positions, they want basically to withdraw from the legal, the legality, the state legality. But Basque people or Catalonian people, Galician people, we want Europe to go beyond to those things that are meant to be internal of the state. Europe is already, and it should be also in future, far more than the combination of all the states it's made out of. So Basque people, for more than 800 years, we've had a European state that was known as the Navarra Kingdom, and that kingdom stopped existing by as a consequence of a military invasion. So Basque people have also a language and a culture that is non-Indo-European. It's older, and it survived the Roman invasion, and it survives also the invasion or the influence of many cultures. And in the different regional governments, in Navarra, the Navarra regional government, and in the Basque regional government, we have historic rights, which are current rights, but that go back in history prior to a situation, prior to the Constitution. So the historic rights we have do not come from the Spanish Constitution, and they do not come from the regional government status. In the Constitution, there is respect. They point this out, but in a bad drafting, because they say that these rights are linked to certain territories. The historic rights that, in fact, as I say, are current rights, are basically linked to the societies that currently live in the regional government in the Basque Country and in Navarra. And these current rights, the people that benefit from those rights are the Basque people. We are a community, and basically we are talking about tax rights and economic rights that are regulated together, and we negotiate a process that we negotiate every 5 years. And this process, it's negotiated between the regional government and the central government. These historic rights, as I said, are collective rights of our society, and we can only refer to them within the framework of the self-determination. When we update these historic rights, we must do it within the framework of the right to decide. So that's why in the Basque Country, that is in the Spanish state, in the Navarra and the regional government of the Basque Country, we have different types of arguments. We have constitutional rights, because we are basically making use of these rights that precede the Spanish Constitution, but that are nevertheless current. And we don't want to focus so much on this historic element, arguing that it's something we've inherited. But what we do need to remind everybody of the very nature of these rights that do not come from the Spanish Constitution and that on many occasions have not been properly defended because they've been presented before a political tribunal that comes from the Constitution, which is the Constitutional Tribunal, Tribunal Constitucional. This said, the basic arguments that in favor of the right to decide are linked to the core of democracy and are linked to the right to decide by each of those individuals. So that's why they're within the framework of the human rights. The right to decide is not only a democratic right, but basically democracy should acknowledge this right to decide, to live in full democracy. And this is an argument that must be properly expressed. So a democratic society, if it's fully democratic, it must respect the right to decide of its peoples and the right to decide of those individuals as members of a group of people, and this must be linked to them belonging to that group of people. The result of the so-called Ibarretxe Plan, which could be considered a failure, has got serious consequences because it precedes all this situation in which we are involved at the moment. And basically what we saw there was that certain political groups, they proclaimed that they were there to defend the right for people to decide by themselves. But as I say, it's the Constitution and the Tribunal Constitucional, the Constitutional Tribunal, they are the tools used by the Spanish government and making use of these tools, they want to take this right to decide away from us. For Euskal Herria, the right to decide, it's something that is linked to the potential success of the Catalonians. And also, we are expecting to see what will happen in Scotland and in other European nations. Catalonia, apart from being a great European nation, is involved now in a process that is linked to the same right we're trying to use, and it's based on the same right. But in the case of Catalonia, we will see the potential impact and the consequences for Euskal Herria, for the Basque nation. The Catalonian process will also be affected by things that may happen in other European territories. So that's why we are here in Brussels optimistic. We think that this debate has got serious implications from the European perspective. This centralized Spanish attitude must be brought back to a democratic framework coming from Europe. What we've seen recently is that business people that are not from a particular country, they are installed they're present in the Basque Country or in Catalonia, they forget easily what's happened in the past. And the challenge that we face is the same. How do we present in words the right to decide? How can we ensure that people on an individual basis or as a group can argue and can present these democratic rights, among them the right to decide? In Euskal Herria, in the Basque Country, we don't have an institution that represents the whole region, Iparralde, Navarre, and the Basque Autonomous Region. And since we don't have this institution, we have a problem that is difficult to resolve. This said, there could be different strategies so that we work together between the Navarra regional government, the Basque regional government, and Iparralde, so that together we ensure that the strategies are brought up not always simultaneously, but they could be brought up in a different way. And specifically in Navarra, the tension with the Navarran attitude that is represented by the UPN party that is currently in office requires a political proposal that must be democratic, must be thorough, and must show solidarity to its people. Going from the attitude that we've seen coming from Spain in Navarra between two parties, the UPN and the PSN, that system will not be dismantled unless they lose elections. And that system will not be dismantled because none of this party has lost power. PSN is not the Socialist Party of Navarra. It's not a representative of the Spanish Socialist Party, and it's not an alternative, and it's a sort of middle way between EH Bildu and UPN, which are the left-wing groups. And basically what it will do is to vote in favor or present itself in favor of UPN right after a demonstration that took place in Pamplona that many of us will remember. And basically they took hostage, or they were against Zapatero at the time. The UPN asked the Spanish Socialist Party and the Euskadi Socialist Party in the regional autonomous Navarra, the autonomous regional government, and the Basque regional government. Now they don't have the excuse of violence, because peace is not giving us a gift to the Basque people. Peace is not a gift, and peace is sometimes not even recognized. But we are making peace. Peace, you can see it in the Guernica agreement, and it's been achieved on a unilateral basis. In other words, peace is being achieved with a lot of suffering, but not at a political price. And that's how we must go forward. We must have intermediaries, international intermediaries, and we must also call for ETA to be a civil organization for as long as there are political prisoners, questions to answer, and responsibility to face. So there's no reason now for the basic rights to be restricted under the anti-terrorist legislation. This is something that we asked for a long time ago in Guernica. We are at the forefront of the Europe of the future, and the Basque country of the future that must learn from other peoples, such as the people in Catalonia or in Galicia, and we must learn from the experience and the initiatives of peoples, such as the people in Scotland or the Flemish community. There are no alien experiences to us. They're experiences because they're ours, because they've got a direct implication on what we do. So we must show evidence that independentism, it's not something against the citizens of Spain, France, or any other country, but it is better. It is better even for them. That's the only way for us to win. I'm convinced that we will win in the future, and I just wish that the different nations will also win. In as much as people proud of our nation, we think that Euskal Herria, the Basque country, is not only our nation, it's a reference for a cultural reference for all our personal identities. Euskal Herria, well, we basically shouldn't be afraid of the right to decide. Something that may happen at different speeds in each of the different parts of this Basque country. As democratic people and respecting those that are not Abertzales, not nationalists, that live together with us in our society, we are not scared of this right to decide. So people I mean, things that don't happen simultaneously. The development could take place at different speeds in different regions of the Basque Country. Our political adversary are not those citizens that are not nationalist or are Abertzale. To us, the enemy is the centralized attitude that we find in Madrid or we find in Paris. And we must repeat again, based on the ruling by the the 2010 International Court, that does no longer excuse violence and expresses things how they are. Our adversary, our political adversary, are not those people, non-nationalist people, but our adversary is that centralist attitude. We have democratic reasons. We have legal reasons too, so that we can exercise our right to decide, which is a democratic right and is also something needed within democracy today that must be exercised fully. Euskal Herria, it's a nation, it should have its right to decide, it's good for it, and we must find for ways, democratic ways, so that we can make use of this right. There's also the requirements, the fact that we want to exercise our rights peacefully and in solidarity with all those people that do not share with us the option that we propose to be independent, an independent nation. Thank you very much.
Bien. Nous allons donc passer au...
Thank you very much. I think we can now open the discussion. Before I give the floor to you in the room, I must say that as elected members of the Parliament and as members of IFA, we need to denounce the attitude of Commissioner Almunia and the Commission in general. When Mr. Almunia said that he had to express himself to, well, protect the Catalans, I must say that he goes well outside the scope of his competences. He did not speak as a commissioner, and he did not speak as an individual. He spoke as someone acting on behalf of the Spanish state. And I think that when Mr. Almunia does what he does, I think obviously he is not acting fairly, he's not acting independently, and this is something that we should denounce, and that's what I wanted to do this morning. Having said that, 2 weeks ago we were in Strasbourg with Iñaki and other MEPs. Europe is of course more than just Mr. Almunia, and as mentioned recently, the recent ruling of the European Court of Justice criticizing the attitude of the Spanish state against Basque activists is something that has to be well, highlighted as a good decision, as a needed decision, and as a useful ruling that is going to certainly help our colleagues and friends from the Basque Country, and I think this is certainly something that can be really highlighted as a useful ruling. That's all I wanted to say. I want to make a comment on the long term, though. What we do here is something that is going to be a positive contribution to Europe. Europe has been building itself for 50 years now, 2 generations, but Europe is not just a process that you have to see from one election to the next or one generation to the next. Europe has to be seen as a much more longer-term process with a historical long-term perspective, and because of that we need to understand that Europe has to change, will change, and if Europe has to resist to the passing of time, it has to be flexible, it has to be able to adapt itself to the desires of its peoples, and particularly the democratic desires and hopes of many of its citizens. If Europe remains stuck on what it was in the 1950s, when we were just outside or just coming out of the war, of a civil war, after all, the Second World War was a European civil war. At the time, things were what they were. We've moved on, and if we want Europe to be a sustainable construction in the long term, then we need to truly look at it from another perspective, from changing perspectives. We're not in the 1950s, we're not in the 1960s anymore, and we need to reject those, well, this inability to be flexible that Europe has sometimes shown. And that is what we are trying to achieve in all the territories from Corsica to the Basque Country to Flanders and Scotland. That's all I was going to say this morning. I'd like now to give you the floor if you have any question. And I see 1, 2, so Peio first and Anna then. And Lorca then.
Mila esker, Alfonso jauna, eta mila esker baita aleri Euskal Herrian baden eskubide bat ganbera honetan azaltzeko aukera mateagaitik. Más que una pregunta, es una pequeña...
Rather than a question, I just wanted to say something in Basque. It's one of the oldest languages in Europe, and it's a language that's in danger because we don't see our right to decide being recognized. In the Basque Country, as well as in the other stateless nations, we have our own process for sovereignty, and we appreciate any spaces for reflection like we have today. It's important to be able to share experiences and to have our references recognized. The recognition of the right to decide is seen very differently in the different points in Europe, in the different states in Europe. And the most important element, perhaps, is the democratic quality of the states where we are. In Scotland, the right to self-determination has a democratic basis. In the Spanish state, the mere fact of talking about it is questionable, and we can't even exercise it. And that is very important for these processes of sovereignty and self-determination. In our particular case, and in our process for self-determination, we consider that the best way to achieve is to do what Scotland's done, is to reach agreements with the central state. It's the best way to do it slowly, to base ourselves on the democratic rules, and to give the possibility to citizens to choose what they want for the future, what organization they want for their society. But we very much fear that it's impossible in our country, and it's because there's a big lack of democracy within the central Spanish state. Our Catalan friends have been able to notice it. We've just heard about it. And I think the only way is the unilateral way, because it's got legitimacy, it's got the agreement of citizenship, and we think it's the only way. We also tried, Paxi Zabaleta has said, we tried to change the political framework through an agreement, but because the Spanish government didn't want to contribute, it became a failure. What other solution do we have? We have the reference of the Basque society and the unilateral way. The central Spanish government doesn't want to listen to our claims. We have to opt for the Scottish way, but that would also mean that the Spanish central state could block this process, and we are not willing to go this way. I think the final decision has to be taken by the Basque citizens and their politicians, and I think we are very glad to see new civil moments, grassroots movements appear, not only to defend our rights, but to make it known and to explain it. It doesn't mean that we have to abandon our responsibilities and leave everything to society. The social movements have to be accompanied by institutions and political parties. All the efforts will be short of what we want to achieve. We have to take into account that our reality is a reality that is means that we are stuck between two states, Spain and France, and we have two autonomous communities in Spain, and the lack of political recognition by the French state. Therefore, we have two ways, and we have to build this from within, and we have to exercise this right to decide. But this also means that we have to walk on this way thinking that who's got to decide is the citizen. But we also have to know that these citizens will need different speeds in the processes, but it will be achieved in the end. We have to build up common institutions to take into account the needs of the citizenship, both in the north and the south. In the north, we have to have our own entity, and then we have to achieve coordination between the north and the south. It'll be a natural process for a community that has much more in common. And I think that our other reference has to be the European Union. We have a lot to learn from the other people's experience, and we will go on doing it. Thank you.
Merci Théo. Anna Miranda, donc.
Thank you, Theo.
Thank you very much.
A estas tres visións do mundo. É unha pena que hoxe non este aquí un representante da representación española de España ante a Unión Europea, que sempre está cando organizamos actos nacionalistas. É unha pena que non veña a escoitar para aprender. Eu quería simplemente lembrar que cando eu como diputada europea sustituín ao querido Oriol Junqueras neste Parlamento, a primeira intervención foi en catalán, en euskera, en galego. Somos pobres europeos Andrés, somos povos europeos con dereitos, e lle digo a Pachi Zabaleta ou a Pello que diga o mesmo en euskera porque non me lembro. Pero esa primeira intervención era o símbolo do que iba a ser posteriormente a nosa representación. Non é só unha representación galega, non é só unha representación...
I'm sorry about this. It's not the representation of a mere state, but a representation of everybody, the peoples that form a big, large coalition. And 10 years ago, we had the intergroup of the stateless nations. It was presided by Camilo Nogueira, the first Galician MEP. And 10 years ago, we talked about the right to self-determination in a normal dialogue with no stress and no pressure. And I would like to ask the members of our panel, who are real experts in the right to decide, what do you think? How could we achieve this right to decide in a different Europe, a social Europe, a Europe that's closer to its citizens? What is your vision of an alternative Europe? A Europe that's against the liberal Europe that's all over the place today.
Au panel de réagir aux trois premières interventions.
Thank you to the European Free Alliance to discuss this subject of the stateless nations and to give us the possibility to be here with all of you. I'll try not to repeat what Pello and Pachi have said, because I fully agree with what they've said, and I would just like to stress a few elements in their discourse. Half of the member states in the European Union achieved their independence in the 20th century. So I think we are not wrong when we say that the secession processes is a question of time in Europe too, and that's what we can see now in Scotland, in Catalonia, in Flanders, and in other stateless nations in Europe. In the Basque Country, we have also said very often that we wish to be able to decide freely about our future, and therefore we are convinced that we have to go on working and going the Basque way. It's been said several times that the right to decide is a democratic right. I would like to add something to that. As well as being a democratic right, it's the instrument, it's the most efficient instrument to solve political conflicts. Therefore, the right to decide is also an instrument for peace. In the context of Europe, and I think we can see this in the peace process in Ireland, in the Basque Country, we have a historic opportunity to have a peaceful situation that will last in time. And I think the exercise of the right to decide has to be one of the basic pillars to build on this new situation. And dialogue and negotiation between the different parties is something that's necessary, and it's the best way forward. And I would like to stress what's been said very often in this institution. The European Union could and should play a decisive role when it comes to solve the conflict in the Basque Country, because it has the experience and the necessary instruments to do so. And we, in Sortu, in Basque Country, we hope that it can be achieved. Thank you.
I would like to ask the panelists to react to those three comments and observations and to answer the questions that have been asked. Maybe we can start the other way around.
I'd also like to say the following, that because of the closeness and the cooperation that we've had, I agree with what people have said earlier. And I'd like to add that Europe is now much more than the different states that made up Europe together. It's more than the sum of the parts, and the exercise of the right to decide has got serious implications in terms of democracy, and it shouldn't be subject to the states that come from hundreds of years of history. It should be based on solidarity among its people and modernization.
Molt ràpid. L'estat espanyol és un estat i per tant té molts instruments, molts més d'aquells que no tenim un estat. L'estat espanyol utilitza instruments per defensar.
The Spanish state is a state, so it's got more tools than the ones we have, and they use these tools to defend their privileges, their rights. So our only strength is democracy. That's the only thing we have, the only tool that would allow us to win the democratic battle, and that's making use of democracy. That's why the response must always be the same, democracy. The Spanish state is a state, and they have these typical tools that states use, and that is an advantage within the framework of the European institutions. It's obvious that here, if we had a Spanish minister here today, the audience would be made up of different people. They would be present from the other states, but and there would be people that are not present here today for that very reason. So the states, they've got their own tools, but they can also be weaker than what they may seem at first sight. The Spanish government has got more than 400 complaints based on the competition. Basically, they've got a huge number of claims for not complying with EU directives. The Spanish government has got the highest number of rulings against it by the Strasbourg Tribunal. So we see all the weaknesses of the Spanish state, economic and legal. So the Spanish state, it's number one when it comes to some indexes from the European Union, an index that brings the unemployment rate and the public deficit. So Spain scores highest on that, not Cyprus, not Bulgaria. It is Spain. So Spain is a state that by being a state, it's got its own tools, but as I say, it's also got a lot of weaknesses. We will have to see if democracy is as strong as it should be in order to question a state that is too weak. We feel that democracy will be sufficiently strong because there will be the willingness from the people, the democratic majority. So in the end of the day, most people will be able to say whether democracy is a proper tool or not. Is it legitimate that the Spanish state is against the independence of Catalonia? Yes, the truth is that it is legal. They've got every right to oppose to the Catalonian independence. But is it legitimate for the Spanish state to stop citizens to decide in a democratic way? No, the answer is obviously no, it shouldn't be legitimate because democracy prevails. So the Spanish state can be against independence, but it cannot be against democracy. And those that say the Spanish state basically translates democracy as independence, because well, when the Spanish state can decide, can stop us from voting. So it's stopping us from making exercise of our rights. And as you can imagine, what we are going to do is to try to vote. We will try to do that over and over again, and we will vote. So that's something they cannot forbid us indefinitely. They cannot stop us from exercising our democratic right. We will clearly find our way. It'll take us longer. But we will. And we will do it through a referendum first. We will call for parliamentary elections, or the other way around, first parliamentary elections and a referendum later on. But we will find a way to do it. And there's something also that is very obvious to me. And that is that, as many colleagues at the European Parliament and the European Commission say, and this is something I've heard on many occasions by Raúl Romero, for example, and other people, they say you need a democratic mandate. And yes, we do have it, which are the elections last year to the Catalonian Parliament, where we obtained a wide majority. And what do we want now? Well, we want another democratic mandate. So we want the referendum. We will be getting democratic mandates, and sooner or later we'll find a way.